The modal auxiliary verb that you choose to use will depend on the degree of likelihood in the mind of the speaker. Here are some percentages of likelihood. That'll be my sister, she always calls it this time, 99% certain, based on knowledge of habits and routines. That must be my sister, I'm sure, 95% certain. I should pass, I've studied hard. 80% probable, positive expectation. Only use this for things that you hope will happen, so if your uncle's dying, I don't think you should say he should die. It can rain a lot in London in April, 75% probable, a recognized feature of London. May, might, and could represent possibility. If you deliver the letter now, she may be in her office. 50% possible, more formal. She might be in her office. 45% possible. She could be in her office. 40% possible. These percentages are just my opinion, they're not scientific. Likelihood can also depend on your tone of voice, body language, etc. Here's the form for modal auxiliary verbs of likelihood in the present. Certain in the affirmative. That'll be my sister, she always calls it this time. That must be my sister. In the negative. That won't be my sister, she never calls it this time. That can't or couldn't be my sister. For these two negative forms, the speaker is thinking, I'm sure it's not my sister. Probable. I should pass the exam, I've studied hard. It can rain a lot in London in April. You shouldn't fail the exam, you've studied hard. It tends not to rain a lot in London in August. There's a small star next to shouldn't because it can be a bit confusing because it's often used for obligation. Possible. If you call her now, she may, might, or could be in her office. Negative. If you call her now, she may not be in her office. If you call her now, she mightn't or she might not be in her office. So the may, might, and could examples all mean, I think it's possible she's in her office. And the negative forms, I think it's possible she's not in her office. But remember, the negative form of could here has a different meaning. It means certainty rather than possibility. Let's move to the past and certainty in the affirmative. That'll have been my sister, she always calls. That must have been my sister. And in the negative, that won't have been my sister, she never calls. That can't or couldn't have been my sister. The two sentences mean, I'm sure it wasn't my sister. Probable. I should have passed the exam, I studied hard. He could be quite annoying when he was a kid. This form of could is often used to describe characteristics of people. Negative. You shouldn't have failed the exam, you studied hard. It tended not to rain in London 50 years ago. Possible. In the affirmative, she may, might, or could have been in her office. These three sentences mean, I think it's possible she was in her office. And the negative, she may not have been in her office, she mightn't or might not have been in her office. These two mean, I think it's possible she wasn't in her office. Remember again that the negative form of could for possibility can only be may not or might not, as couldn't refers to certainty. Now for the future. Certainty. If someone calls at 10 p.m., that'll be my sister. If someone calls at 10 p.m., it won't be my sister. Notice there's no must form for future. Nor is there a can't or couldn't form for future. Probable. I should pass next week's exam. I studied hard. You shouldn't fail next week's exam. You studied hard. Notice that there is no can form for future, nor is there a tends not to form for future. Possible. She may, might, or could be in her office later. She may not be in her office later. She mightn't or might not be in her office later. You cannot use could in the negative for future possibility. Thank you, that's all for now. If you'd like to see part 2 of this lesson, On-Screen English Lesson 25B, Modal Auxiliary Verbs for Likelihood, please click on the link. Here's a practice activity for modal auxiliary verbs for likelihood. Fill in the gaps in the sentences below with a modal auxiliary verb of likelihood. Decide whether the concept is certain, probable, or possible. See the information in brackets for clues, whether the time idea is past, present, or future, and whether the modal auxiliary verb should be in the affirmative or negative form. There may be more than one possible answer. Here are the answers. Number 1. It can't or couldn't have been easy doing 3 jobs at once, meaning I'm sure it wasn't easy. 2. The food at the restaurant can be very spicy, meaning it probably is, it's a well-known feature. 3. You were driving so fast you could, might, or may have crashed. I think it was possible. 4. That delivery will be from my parents. It's my birthday. They always send me a present. 5. It shouldn't be too difficult to arrive in 3 hours. I'm optimistic. I think it's probable. And number 6. If you arrive at noon tomorrow, I may, might, or could be free. I think it will be possible. Here's a summary of the lesson. Modal auxiliary verbs for likelihood. Use them to express certainty, probability, and possibility. Degree of likelihood. It depends on the speaker's interpretation. If something is, was, or will be certain, probable, or possible in their mind. Use the correct negative and past forms. Some modal auxiliary verbs don't have future forms. And here's a rule of thumb. Percentages for degrees of likelihood are not scientific, but they can give you a rough idea. 99% will, 95% must. For certainty. For probability, 80% should, 75% can. For possibility, 50% may, 45% might, and 40% could. But as I've already said, these are percentages that I've invented to give you a rough idea. Degrees of likelihood can also be conveyed through body language, intonation, and other factors. I must eat less junk food. I have to write an essay once a week. Let's think about the concept for these two sentences. Is the obligation coming from the speaker, or is it external? For the first sentence, the obligation is from the speaker. It's personal. For the second sentence, it's what we call external obligation. I have to follow the rules. Here are the different forms for must and have to for obligation. I've divided it into obligation from the speaker and external obligation, and I'll be looking at present, past, and future. So let's look first at obligation from the speaker in the present. Affirmative, I must study harder. Negative, you don't have to study harder. Negative, you mustn't smoke in the building. There's a difference in meaning between the two negative forms. If you say you don't have to study harder, it means it's not necessary. But if you say you mustn't smoke in the building, it means it's prohibited. External obligation in the present. Affirmative, I have to or I have got to do a lot of homework. Negative, I don't have to or I haven't got to do much homework. Have got to and haven't got to are more common in British English. Obligation from the speaker in the past. I had to make such an effort last term. Affirmative. I didn't have to make an effort last term. Negative. External obligation. Affirmative. I had to do a lot of homework last term. Negative. I didn't have to do a lot of homework last month. Future. Obligation from the speaker. Affirmative. I must study harder. This can imply future meaning. Also affirmative. I have to or I will have to study harder next term. And negative, I won't or I don't have to study harder next term. and external obligation in the future. Affirmative, I have to or I will have to do a lot of homework next term. And negative, I won't or I don't have to do a lot of homework next term. And here's one final point. We often use need to instead of have to because the meanings are similar. For the task, fill in the gaps in the sentences below with the form of must or have to, and make sure to use the correct form, past, present or future, affirmative or negative. Here are the answers. 1. I must quit smoking, but I lack self-discipline. 2. When I was a child, I had to do extra homework every night. My parents made me. 3. Next term, he has to or will have to take 5 exams. He will have no choice. 4. My sister has to take extra vitamin D or vitamin D every day. Her doctor told her to. 5. Students mustn't smoke inside any buildings. It's forbidden. 6. I don't have to wake up early as I live next to the school. I'm so glad it's not necessary. Here's a summary of the lesson. Use must when the sense of obligation comes from the speaker. Must has no past or future form for obligation. Use other modal auxiliary verbs. I must give up smoking. Use have to when the sense of obligation is external, from someone or something else. For example, I have to take this medicine for 2 weeks. Have got to is an alternative to have to, especially in British English. I've got to take this medicine for 2 weeks. Need to is an alternative to have to, as the meanings are close. For example, I need to take this medicine for 2 weeks. Here are 2 sentences that show how to use should and ought to. You should eat more fruit and vegetables. You ought to eat more fruit and vegetables. And the concept. Is there any difference in meaning between the 2 sentences? The answer is no, the meaning's the same. Ought to is used more in British English. Is the sense of obligation stronger than must? The answer is no, it's weaker, as it's only a recommendation, not a strong obligation. Here are the forms for should and ought to in the present, past, and future. Let's begin with the affirmative and negative sentences for should in the present. You should eat less junk food. You shouldn't eat so much junk food. And ought to. The first thing to mention about ought to is it's more common in British English. It's also important to note that the negative forms are less common today for ought to. Most people use should for negatives. Here are the negative forms in the present for ought to. You ought to eat less junk food. In the negative forms for ought to can be omitted. So the negative form in the present would be you ought not or you oughtn't eat so much junk food. Or you could include to. You ought not or you oughtn't to eat so much junk food. I personally always use shouldn't instead, as it's easier. The past forms in the affirmative and negative are you should have gone to the party. You shouldn't have stayed at home. And ought to. You ought to have gone to the party. Or you ought not or oughtn't to have stayed at home, with to as optional. Again, this is not a very common form. And the future. In the affirmative, you should attend all your classes next term. Negative, you shouldn't skip classes next term. And ought to. Affirmative, you ought to attend all your classes next term. And the negative, you ought not or you oughtn't to skip classes next term, with to optional. For the practice task, fill in the gaps in the sentences below with a form of should or ought to, and make sure to use the correct form, past, present or future, affirmative or negative. If it's negative, use should instead of ought to, as should is more common. Here are the answers. Number 1. You really should or ought to get a haircut. 2. You should have or ought to have told me sooner that you couldn't understand the class. 3. I really think you shouldn't work so much. You need a holiday. 4. I shouldn't have stayed up so late last night. I'm too tired to work. And 5. Should I go to the doctor's tomorrow to get a checkup? Notice here for the question form, should comes before the subject I. To study more on question forms, see on screen English, Lesson 18, Asking Questions. Here's the lesson summary. When should you use should or ought to make recommendations? And the meaning? The meaning's the same for both. It's a milder obligation than must. And the usage? Ought to is less common, especially the negative forms. Let's look at these 3 sentences. Number 1, I need to have 8 hours sleep a night. 2, I didn't need to pay the bill, my boss paid. 3, I needn't have paid the bill, what a waste of money. The concept for sentence 1, does need to refer to a necessity or recommendation? The answer, it refers to a necessity. Sentence 2, paying the bill wasn't necessary, but did the speaker pay? And the answer, the speaker didn't pay. 3, paying the bill wasn't necessary, but did the speaker pay? The answer, the speaker paid. Here are the forms for need to and needn't. In the present, affirmative, I need to come to the meeting. Negative, you don't need to come to the meeting. And needn't, you needn't come to the meeting. In the present form, there's no difference in meaning between the two. Past. Affirmative, I needed to pay, it wasn't free. Negative, I didn't need to pay, it was free. The negative here means it was unnecessary and I didn't pay. Needn't, I needn't have paid as I was a club member. The negative here means it was unnecessary but I paid. Future. Affirmative, I need to or will need to save more money next year. Negative, I won't or I don't need to save any money next year. And I needn't save any money next year. This use of needn't for future is possible but not common. For the practice task, fill in the gaps in the sentences below with a form of need or needn't, and make sure to use the correct form, past, present or future, affirmative or negative. Here are the answers. 1. I didn't need to pay because my boss invited me. It was unnecessary and I didn't pay. 2. There was a huge delay at the passport office, so I needed to be very patient. 3. You needn't have paid, but thanks for paying. You paid and it was unnecessary. 4. In the future, people will need to use less water in their daily lives. And 5. My friend told me I need to or needed to be more positive. Needed to here is in the past tense because it's reported speech. But if I still need to be positive now at the time of speaking, it's not necessary to change the tense. See on screen English lesson 35 for more on reported speech. I've put 2 stars here next to the sentences where have to can replace need to, as the meaning external obligation is similar. If you haven't already done the lesson on modal auxiliary verbs for obligation, must and have to, see on screen English lesson 26. Now for the lesson summary. You can use need to when something is necessary. For example, I need to sleep 8 hours a night. It is necessary. And the past forms? The meaning changes. For example, I didn't need to pay the bill because my boss invited me means I didn't pay. But if you say, I needn't have paid the bill, what a waste of my money, it means I paid and it wasn't necessary. And it's quite common to use have to with the meaning of external obligation, because the meaning is close. If you say I need to take this medicine for 2 weeks, it's almost the same meaning as I have to take this medicine for 2 weeks. Let's begin with these two sentences. Can I leave now? Number 1. Could you please be quiet? Number 2. And if we think about the concept, which sentence is asking permission and which is making a request? Number 1 is asking permission, can I leave now? And number 2, could you please be quiet, making a request. Here is the form for asking permission and making requests. Asking permission, may I leave now? Can I leave now? Both are in question form, so the auxiliary verb can or may would come in front of the subject, I. May I leave now is the polite form, and can I leave now is less polite, more informal. Now for making requests. Would you, could you, can you, please be quiet? Would you is a polite form. Could you is also polite. Can you is less polite, again more informal. When you're making requests, the question mark is not always used. For the practice task, fill in the gaps in the sentences below with a modal auxiliary verb for asking permission or making requests. Pay attention to the information in brackets regarding politeness. There may be more than one possible answer. Here are the answers. Number 1. Can I be excused from the table? Asking permission, less polite. 2. May I be excused from the table? Asking permission, more polite. 3. Do you think I could use your car today? Making a request, more polite. If you wanted to be very polite, you could say, do you think I might use your car today? Number 4. Can you be quiet? Making a request, less polite. You could also say, will you be quiet? For a less polite request. Number 5. Could you or would you be a little more quiet, please? Making a request, more polite. And number 6, would you mind changing seats, please? Making a request, more polite. Here's a summary of the lesson. For permission and requests, it's common to use modal auxiliary verbs. Regarding politeness, it depends on whom you're speaking to and what it is you want. Whom you're speaking to. Could you speak a little louder, please? This might be a student speaking to the teacher in the polite form. Can you be quiet? This might be a parent to a child in the less polite form. What do you want? Could you let me use your car today? This could be a teenager asking their parent in the polite form because it's asking a lot, and they might expect a no answer. Can I watch TV? This is a teenager to a parent in the less polite form because it's not asking so much, and the teenager might expect a yes answer. Let's look at the conversation below between Anna and Bella to see how will and shall can be used. Anna says, I need some help with the application form. Bella replies, have you asked your brother? Anna, he won't help me anymore. Bella, okay, I'll check it now if you send me the form. Anna, shall we look at it together when you're free? For the concept, which sentences express willingness and which are suggestions? When Anna says he won't help me anymore, it means he's not willing to, so it's willingness. Then Bella says, okay, I'll check it now. This means I'm willing to check it. Again, willingness. And Anna says, shall we look at it together? This means I suggest that we look at it together. So this is a suggestion. Let's look at the form for expressing willingness and making suggestions. So, for expressing willingness, Anna says, "Will you help me with the car? It won't start. The battery's dead. I asked Paul, but he wouldn't help." Bella replies, "Yes, I will, but I won't accept any money." When Anna says, "Will you help me with the car?" what she means is, "Are you willing to help me?" Then when she says it won't start, what she's saying is it refuses to start. It's as if the car is unwilling. When she says Paul wouldn't help, she means he refused to help. "Yes, I will" means, yes, I'm willing to. "But I won't accept any money" means, but I refuse to accept any money. Making suggestions. Anna says, "Shall we go to the cinema tonight?" Bella replies, "What film shall we watch?" Anna says, "I'm not sure. Shall I check what's on?" "Oh, I forgot I have a meeting tonight." Bella replies, "Shall we not go then?" When Anna says, "Shall we go?" or "Shall I check?" she means, I suggest that we go or check. Bella finishes by saying, "Shall we not go then?" This is the negative question form of shall. Bella could also use the negative form "Shan't we go then?" but this is quite old-fashioned now. For the task, fill in the gaps in the sentences below with a modal auxiliary verb for expressing willingness or making suggestions. Here are the answers. Number 1. No, I won't help you. It's not appropriate, to express willingness. 2. He said he wouldn't help me because it was not appropriate. Willingness. 3. Shall we go by car or train? Suggestion. 4. Will you help me carry this? Willingness. It's also possible to say, would you help me carry this? 5. Shall we not go? Have you changed your mind? Suggestion. And number 6, of course I'll help you. It's my pleasure. Willingness. Here's the summary of the lesson. To express willingness or lack of it, you should use will or won't for the present and would or wouldn't for the past. For example, in the present, I will do it, I won't do it. And in the past, she said she would do it, she said she wouldn't do it. To make suggestions, you should use shall or shall not. For example, shall we go and see a film tonight? Shall we not go? Shan't we go? Remember, shan't is a bit old-fashioned. You can also use shall to make offers. For example, shall I check the grammar in your essay?